Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, and thank you for staying. When you stood up, I thought, well, they're all leaving. Look, I just told the Annie Moses band backstage, I said, what a deal. I got to follow you guys. Aren't they terrific? They're just amazing. Now, for those of you that ever watched my Fox News show, you might know that they had been guests on the show, and what a delight to have them on the show and to be able to reunite with them here tonight, at least to say hello to them, and to listen to them. They're just amazing, and they're so, well, unbelievably talented. And I got to play with them when they were guests on my show. And as often would be the case, people would say to me, wow, you were playing with the Annie Moses band? I mean, because they're really good. I mean, several of those guys are Juilliard-trained musicians. I mean, they're not just, kind of musician like I am. They're really good. And people would see me play with people like the Annie Moses band or Toby Keith or Andy Williams and these people I'd have on my show, and they said, wow, Huckabee, I watched you play with some of these guys. I had no idea you were that good. To which I always said, I'm not that good, but it was my show. What are they going to do, not let me play? It was one of the greatest joys I had in the 6.5 years of doing the Fox News show, was being able to meet some incredible people and to be able to make music with some of them. And it was often the moment where I was so way over my head. But I figured, my sound guys will take care of me, and when I really flub it up, they'll just turn it down and mix it out of there. Didn't really matter. I want to just say what a joy it is to be here tonight at NRB for a host of reasons, not the least of which is that I got to hear Annie Moses band again. And then the other great thrill for me tonight was to be able to be back in the back of the room and listen to my dear friends Chuck and Gina Norris come and receive a much-deserved award. But then for all the nice and wonderful things that they had to say about campaigning with me, and I just can't tell you how much I appreciated that. And I want you to know, all the stuff they said about politics and who they support, it just shows you how brilliant they really are. I mean, thank you, Chuck and Gina, for, well, I really mean it. They're delightful people. And let me tell you something about them. They were saying nice things about me, and that was kind and gracious. But you want to talk about authenticity? I don't know of two people who love their country, love God, love their kids any more than they do. And I was reminding them as we visited after their presentation, we had a chance to visit a few minutes, and I told them, I said, I still remember when we went to this veterans home up in New Hampshire, and you guys were so focused on one particular Korean War veteran who had been in the wheelchair since Korea, and you didn't want to leave him. And when they came out of that veterans home, because we had to go on to the next event, they sat in the vehicle that we were getting into and driving to the next event, and they were both weeping because they had been so touched by the opportunity just to minister and to have contact with that person who had faithfully served our nation. And that's who they are. And I'll tell you, there's another thing that you need to know. Chuck Norris really does do push-ups by pushing the earth down. I've seen him do it. That's really true. This past Sunday, just a few days ago, I was standing on the Golan Heights in Israel. I had taken 253 people there this past couple of weeks. I was standing on the Golan Heights 250 yards from the Syrian border, 2.5 miles from an ISIS encampment. As we stood on the Golan Heights, in the distance, we could hear the explosions of the civil war that were going on in Syria. It was that close. Close enough that even with my messed up, long abused hearing, I could hear them. At least 10 different explosions, rockets, cannon fire off in the distance. It was almost surreal as we had that vantage point to be able to know that just not far from us, people were fighting for their lives. And here we were on top of the Golan Heights looking over into that and realizing that we were in many ways like spectators, watching a conflict so close, and yet it might as well have been 1,000 miles from us, because where we were, within the confines of Israel, we were safe. But dear friends, our world is on fire. Our world is in trouble. And the sad thing is, too many Americans are sitting on the sidelines watching it and not realizing that it's time to quit watching and it's time to get involved. We no longer, with the world on fire, can afford to be anything less than firefighters, because there are way too many pyromaniacs trying to lead the world that are causing this fire to grow bigger rather than to recognize the threat that it poses to our very existence. We are at war. It's not that we are facing one. We're in one right now. It is a battle first for our existential existence. I don't know how many different ways it has to be said or demonstrated, but the forces of Islamic jihadism are not the least bit interested in negotiating with us for a piece of property. We are not dealing with the traditional geopolitical foe. We're not dealing with a group of people who would like to have their taxes lowered and are willing to fight for that. We're dealing with people who are willing to hate us to the level that they would behead journalists and relief workers, and not only would they do it, but they would be proud of it to the point of taking pictures and video and posting it all over the world so everyone could see what they're so proud of. Even the Nazis, as evil and diabolical as they were, at least tried to hide what they were doing to the 11 million people they murdered in cold blood. They did everything they could to create euphemistic names for what they were doing, and they told people it was a work camp and not a death machine. We're dealing with an enemy that is absolutely proud and delighted that they are beheading people. And the tragedy we face in this world is we're dealing not only with the very real threat that comes against our existence, but we're dealing with leadership that refuses to acknowledge not only who the enemy is, but what they represent, which is a religious jihad against Christians, Jews, and even other Muslims who do not accept their radical version of it. You cannot defeat an enemy if you don't know who the enemy is. And we're never going to be able to defeat this enemy until we acknowledge that they are religiously motivated. And the nonsense that was spewed out of the mouth of one of the spokeswomen at the State Department when she said, if we could just get to know them better, maybe they need better jobs. Maybe they need some education. Well, we learned even today that Jihadi John is another well-educated, middle-class kid from England. Osama bin Laden was from a wealthy family. Folks, these people don't need jobs. These are not people who are beheading people because they couldn't make it into butcher school. These are people who have a religious bent toward killing every last one of us. And for those who believe that they would stop at Israel, let me just remind us all that the reason that the Prime Minister of Israel, with whom I spoke last week, and who, thank God, is coming to America next week to speak to this country, the reason that it is so important that he does come and speak, and the reason that we need to hear what he has to say, is because he understands something that some of our leaders don't seem to understand, and that is that Israel is not the primary target, it's just the initial practice run. The Iranians have made it very clear that they see Israel as the little Satan, but America as the great Satan. Those are their words. The ultimate goal is not simply to wipe Israel off the face of the map, though that is their stated goal. They've said it repeatedly. That seems pretty serious to me. They finance the operations of Hamas and Hezbollah in every country that surrounds Israel. I do not understand why some people in our government cannot recognize that a threat to Israel is a threat to us. And Israel represents simply Act 1 in what is a long-running narrative in which we are the final scene. I do not think that we can continue as a nation to act in a detached and disinterested way when it comes to the situation that we are faced with, the genuine global threat to our existence. And I want to say that it's been embarrassing to watch so much attack toward Israel. Personally toward the Prime Minister, who I regard not only as a personal friend, but also as a great world leader. And frankly, he is a Churchill in a world of Chamberlains. And God knows we need some Churchill-like leaders in our world today. As I come back from there, I look at the battles that we're facing here in our own country. Religious liberty is under attack as never before. I know you've been talking about it this week at the NRB because there's no way to avoid this topic that now has put Christians in the crosshairs of the government. To be honest with you, I never thought I'd live to see the day when the government decided that it was okay to believe and okay to worship a little bit, but if our beliefs got to the point that they conflicted with the government, then the government was supposed to tell us what the limits of our beliefs could be. How can it be that the federal government of the United States would tell the Little Sisters of the Poor that they can believe, but they can't believe so much that it would conflict with the constraints of Obamacare? How could they tell a wonderful Christian family like the Greens, who have built a magnificent business in which they pay their employees quite well and provide them with a pension and health insurance, far more than most companies do, and they're a privately held company. They don't have to do a lot of the things they do. They've been some of the most generous benefactors to things like biblical museums and charitable operations all across the world. How is it possible that our own government would say to people who have used their own money for the betterment of mankind, it's okay that you guys believe, but maybe you're believing too much? Maybe we should say to the government, maybe it's you are believing too little about God, too little about America, too little about what's right and what's wrong. When people say, well, what can we do? It's all their fault. May I, as graciously and kindly say it as I can, it's not the fault of the unbelievers that we are in the mess we are in. It is the fault of those of us who were called to be salt and light and who somehow never got the light out of the well-lit room and the salt out of the bag and onto that which was putrefying. It is high time that we call attention to what's really at fault in America, and that is that far too many people who claim to love America and love God have watched the battle, have listened to the sound of the cannons, but have ridden to the opposite end of it rather than to get in the middle and say, "Here am I, Lord, send me." In America, there are 80 million self-identified evangelicals. Now, think about that. These are people who, when asked, what is your faith pilgrimage? What is your religious preference? 80 million Americans out of 320 million say, we are evangelicals. Now, that doesn't even include pro-life Catholics, people from the mainline, more liturgical denominations. We're just talking here evangelicals, 80 million. Of the 80 million, only half of them are registered to vote. Half. And of the half registered to vote, only half of them voted in the last presidential election. And of those half, only half voted in an off-year election, like we just had. Here's a shocker. If 4% more of just evangelicals, not conservatives, not Republicans, let's go down and narrow it just to evangelicals. If 4% more of the evangelicals had voted for Mitt Romney in the last election, 2012, we would be addressing President Romney this evening. When I hear people say, I don't want to get involved in politics, I want to just scream, my friend, you're already involved. When the IRS investigates your church and begins to tell preachers what they can and cannot preach, we're already involved. When the government begins to tell us that we have to provide abortifacient drugs that would take the life of an unborn child, we're already involved. When the government tells your church members who run photography studios and operate catering companies that they have to do service for weddings that do not represent their biblical concept of marriage, and they begin to tell you as a church, you have to host any type of wedding that comes your way, then I'm sorry, but you are already involved. The notion that we can sit on the sidelines may have existed at one point when the basic overall prevailing view in America was a God-centered worldview, but that is not the prevailing worldview that we live under anymore. When in Frisco, Texas, an elementary school was told that their children could not wear red and green together in December because it might just make somebody think of Christmas, and that might make them think of Jesus, and we sure couldn't have that in an elementary school. And friends, that didn't happen in Vermont. That happened in Frisco, Texas, which is in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, right in the heart of the Bible Belt. Have we lost our everlasting minds? You can't wear red and green together because it might remind somebody of Christmas? How far we've come from the days when many of us were in school and we had Christmas parties in our public school. I don't ever remember anyone dying from that. Today, kids are suspended if they chew a Pop-Tart in the shape of a gun. Kids are expelled because they use their fingers and say bang. And again, I don't remember anyone ever getting killed from a Pop-Tart. Maybe if they ate too many of them. But our political correctness is killing us at the expense of our freedom. I want to be very clear that religious liberty is at the heart of all liberty. If we lose the ability to believe and to think and to worship and to pray as we wish, even if we don't wish to pray, worship, or believe, if we lose religious liberty, there is no other liberty available. The liberty to speak freely, the liberty of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press ultimately comes down to the freedom of one's belief. That is the freedom of religious liberty. Lose that and we lose it all. And for those who do not think that we are under threat, simply recognize that the fact that we are now in city after city watching ordinances that say that your 7-year-old daughter, if she goes into the restroom, cannot be offended, and you can't be offended if she's greeted there by a 42-year-old man who feels more like a woman than he does a man. Now, I wish someone had told me when I was in high school that I could have felt like a woman when it came time to take showers in PE. I'm pretty sure I would have found my feminine side and said, Coach, I think I'd rather shower with the girls today. You're laughing because it sounds so ridiculous, doesn't it? And yet today, we're the ones who are ridiculed and scorned because we point out the obvious, that there's something inherently wrong with forcing little children to be a part of this social experiment. I'm not against anybody. I'd just like for somebody to bring their brain to work someday and not leave it on the bedstand when they show up to govern. When I think about how many Americans today are working harder than they've ever worked and getting less for it, I realize that there is something incredibly wrong. And the fact is, the policies don't seem to change a whole lot depending on whether Democrats or Republicans in power. And I'm going to give you the little secret. It's because the donor class is the one who pays the piper, and the political class is more than willing to dance to the tune. And as long as the Washington to Wall Street axis of power continues to exist, where the donor class feeds the political class who does the favors for the donor class, who then in turn continues to support the political class, this country is going to be in serious trouble until we ultimately recognize that we have to unshackle ourselves from people who treat Washington as if it is the Roach Motel where they go in but they never come out. There needs to be a limitation on people going into government, that there's a term limit that says you can go in, but you must come out, go home, and live under the laws that you have imposed on the rest of us. But I call to you and to every American of faith that no longer can we be content to sit on the sidelines and hope someone is willing to get involved. Because we have to. I've often been told, I don't want to get into politics. It's a dirty business. I agree. But may I say this as gently as I know how. We all want to eat from a clean plate, but that means somebody has to do dishes. We need a bunch of Americans who are willing to do some dishes and get their arms dirty up to the elbow. When I used to speak at high schools during my time as governor, I'd go to a high school campus, I'd look out there at a bunch of people. These students, I knew the only thing they were halfway interested in was getting out of class. Otherwise, they could care less that I was there on their campus to speak to them. And I was aware that I could see it in their faces. So I'd go out, and the first thing I'd say was this: how many of you are really interested in politics? Not a single kid would lift his hand, not one. Oh, maybe once in a while at some schools, some nerd kid would lift his hand, and I knew that kid was going to get beat up for his lunch money before 11 o'clock. But normally, no one ever lifted a hand. So I'd say, well, boy, I'm glad to see this. Now, that got their attention. And I said, I was really afraid that all of you were really plugged in and interested in politics, and that was going to make my job very difficult. But now that I find you don't care anything about politics, wow, this is easy. Thank you very much. Because here's what we're thinking about. Down at the Capitol, we've been talking that most car accidents happen with drivers under the age of 25. And we figured that one way to fix this is to just change the age at which you can get a driver's license to 25. Suddenly they're interested. They go, no. And I say, another problem, sexually transmitted diseases are rampant among younger people. They don't seem to understand how dangerous that is. So we found a solution. We're going to pass some legislation that will mean that young people can't date unless they're accompanied by their parents until they're 30 years old. Well, they didn't laugh at the high school. And then I would say, and there's another problem, underage drinking, serious issue, but we figured out a way to fix it. We're just going to make it so that no one can purchase alcoholic beverages until they're 35. And at that, these kids are screaming and saying, no, you can't, and how dare you? And I say, hold it. You all told me that you weren't interested in politics. I said, now you seem to be. You see, I would always say to them, kids, let me explain something. Politicians will always tell you they're working for the people, but that's not true. The people can't hire them, and they can't fire them. I said, as long as you guys aren't registered to vote, I'm not the least bit afraid of you. You can't do a thing to me, because only voters hire me, and only voters can fire me. So if you're not interested in politics, you've kind of given me free rein to do whatever I want to do. And I go down to the legislature, and if I can get them to agree to it, we can ruin your lives. We can really mess you guys up some. I said, but the day you become a voter, and the day that you hold my future in your hands, I care a whole lot more about your future because you're holding mine in your hands. And I would say to every single person who sits in a church pew on Sunday, to every person who says, I'm a person of faith, you cannot afford to be uninvolved if you care about what's happening, not only halfway around the world, but it's happening right in your own community. If it bugs you that kids can't wear red and green, if it bugs you that people are having their heads cut off and burned alive while caged like an animal, if it bugs you that charitable sisters, like the Little Sisters of the Poor, are being told they can't believe everything they wish to believe because the government says they can't. If it bugs you that a pastor is being told don't preach that hard because the IRS will ruin your tax-exempt status, then there is one solution to it. Register to vote, show up and vote, and once again say this country doesn't belong to a handful of people who have lost their minds. It belongs to the people who are willing to say America is a good and decent country and we're going to make it that way again. That is in your hands, not the hands of somebody else. Let's make it happen for this country's sake and for our kids. God bless you, and thank you very much for letting me be with you tonight. Thank you, Jerry.